Team Ninja are my favorite studio, but it feels like ever since Itagaki left them back in 2008, after the release of one of my favorite games of all time, Ninja Gaiden 2, a stone cold classic, it feels like the team has been in a bit of a creative purgatory when it comes to the artistic direction of their games. And the thing about this conversation is that whenever we discuss big directors leaving their home studio, so Itagaki leaving Team Ninja, or Mikami leaving Capcom, or now we have Kamiya leaving Platinum, there is the general notion that the majority of the talent that made these franchises what they are tends to lie with these big directors. And so if they leave their home studio and set up their own little pet project studio elsewhere, then that pet project studio will be able to create something equivalent, or at least somewhat equivalent, to what Capcom or Team Ninja or Platinum were doing before them. But if you look at the track record for this trend, that is definitely not the case, and it is almost always the case that the actual home studio ends up doing a lot better than the directors in their little pet project studios. Look at Team Ninja, look at Capcom, we'll see with the Platinum, but usually that is the case. Resident Evil 5 is better than The Evil Within or whatever. Resident Evil 6, that's a little bit more debatable, but at least the Mercenaries mode of Resident Evil 6 is better. And then Team Ninja, they've gone on to make a lot of really great games, of course, like Ninja Gaiden 3, Razor's Edge. It isn't perfect or anything, but I think that thing is much better than it gets credit for. And of course, we have Nioh. And this is because, as much as game journalists or Kojima would like to think otherwise, what makes a game great and what makes a game feel polished and amazing to play are not these big visionary concepts. It's not these big things that everyone talks about and you read in reviews. What makes games feel and play well is finely tuned gameplay mechanics. And the people normally responsible for that are not actually the big directors. Instead, they are the programmers and the supervisors and these type of people that are getting their hands deep into the code and making sure it feels and plays well. This is why big studio games are not cinema. You cannot have a true auteur in this medium at that scale because you need people, a group of people working so tirelessly on all these different aspects of the design, and that is too much for one man to completely supervise and make happen. The magic needs to happen within the team. That being said, the loss of Itagaki, if you look at Team Ninja since he left, it isn't the quality of their actual game design that has fallen off, but rather what's been lost is that charisma, the Riz as the kids would say. That is what has been really lost by Team Ninja in the past few years, and instead of being bold and making large steps forward like they were doing under Itagaki, instead what is happening is that the Team Ninja crew are still very talented and they still get combat design and how to make really engaging deep combat. They still get how to do that better than a lot of other studios out there, but what they don't have is the overall concept of how to stand out as a team. So what has ended up happening, you see post Nioh, is that they've kind of been following along in the trail of Fromsoft, who have now taken the role as the leading visionary Japanese studio. And what is really funny about this relationship is it is an inversion of the past, because in the past, if you look at Ninja Gaiden, the Xbox version, you can see it setting the tone for what would be Dark Souls later. And then also, if you look at the resume of older FromSoft games, they had their own sort of Ninja Gaiden wannabe game that they made. So at one point, you could tell FromSoft were looking at Team Ninja as inspiration, as a model to follow, and now the tables have turned. Team Ninja are looking at FromSoft and following along in their trail. No one has really pointed this out before, but I can't help but notice it, and it is really interesting. But anyway, so what we have now is a situation where FromSoft is like the Coca-Cola, and Team Ninja is like their Pepsi Cola. They're competitor, kind of, but they're also clearly following along and kind of trying to add their own spin to the Dark Souls FromSoft formula. And the thing about it is that in today's market, it isn't necessarily a bad idea for another Japanese studio to sort of take inspiration and make an alternative version to the Dark Souls formula. And in fact, I would argue that when Nioh came out in 2017, this was actually a really clever move, because if you hand me Dark Souls or if you hand me a Team Ninja Nioh style game, I actually do prefer the Team Ninja formula. I do prefer the more combat focused, deeper gameplay elements of these Nioh games as opposed to the more exploration, world building stuff that you get in the Dark Souls series. But the problem is that back in 2017, when Nioh came out, a Dark Souls alternative was an interesting idea. It was an interesting concept. But now in the year 2024, because the Dark Souls formula has now become so prolific and has spread out into basically every other action game out there, what this has caused is Team Ninja to now just sort of blend in with the general crowd. They don't stand out anymore. Now they have become just another Dark Souls wannabe crew compared to all the other Dark Souls wannabe crews out there. And every action game now is taking so much from the Dark Souls, Sekiro style combat design that now when you look at Team Ninja games like Wulong Dynasty and Rise of Ronin, you can't help but feel that they are a bit generic. And I'm a big Team Ninja guy. I love Team Ninja, and I can of course see the specific differences that they are doing with Rise of Ronin that you don't get in something like Elden Ring. But is it enough to justify its own existence artistically, especially with the team as talented as Team Ninja? Because as I'm playing Rise of Ronin, this entire time I'm thinking, Team Ninja, why don't you embrace who you are? I can feel every time I play your guys' games, you want to break out. This is clearly what you want to do, so why take your next game, Rise of Ronin, in such a clearly derivative direction from the Dark Souls series? I mean, it gets to the point where not only do you have the Sekiro-style parry system, but you also literally have like a grappling hook mechanic. It's a little on the nose, Team Ninja. And I know people will point out that Ronin has been in development since 2015, supposedly, before Elden Ring released. But even if that is the case, the first footage of Ronin was not seen until 2022, and it's clear how much they adjusted the game into the Elden Ring Sekiro style at some point in development. I bring this up only because playing Rise of Ronin, this feels like a game that is overstretched. It feels like Team Ninja are pushing themselves outside of what they're able to take on. I give the analogy in the title of butter spread too thin. I think that is the best way I can describe the feel and flow of this game, because it feels very underdeveloped. But I understand that they're going for this more bigger market sort of appeal, so they're trying the open world thing, but it doesn't really complement the overall strengths of the game, which is certainly its combat. It feels like the pace of this game is constantly being interrupted, is constantly having unnecessary downtime, to the point where you might as well just throw on a 2-minute, 3-minute loading screen and I can go up and get a sandwich and come back. That is how engaging the non-combat gameplay of Rise of Ronin is. And in fact, as I was playing through the missions and having the multiple dialogue trees and like interacting with the NPCs and going from mission to mission, there was a game that rose in my mind that sharply stood out as like a similar experience to Rise of Ronin, not combat wise, but in terms of game design, level design wise, which was old Jade Empire on the Xbox. Do you all remember that? Jade Empire, the BioWare game that was supposed to be this big follow-up to the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic game. Yeah. Well, at least Rise of Ronin has decent combat, but the dialogue trees and kind of the interactions with the game and all of that stuff really reminds me quite a bit of Jade Empire, which is not a flattering comparison. But one thing I really wanted to emphasize is that when it comes to games that have a heavy focus on combat, open world design is not a good fit. It is not a good fit for two reasons. The first reason I've already talked about in various reviews on this channel, but I'll bring it up once again, which is gameplay density, which is basically how frequently are you engaging in the core content of the gameplay and how intense is your engagement with the core content. And so the hallmark example of high gameplay density would be in the shoot 'em up genre, in the shmup genre, a game like Ketsui, where all the decision making and all the combat is highly compressed to the point where every single second you need to make decision upon decision upon decision, and these decisions compound on one another into an overall result of success or failure. But the problem with a lot of modern action games now is that they break up the intensity, they break up the pace, and they break up the core content into these little distinct slices. And this is something that you see heavily in Rise of Ronin, where you're going along, you have a little combat encounter in a village, you complete the combat encounter, you regain your resources, you have an isolated event there, you travel along, you have another isolated event in another village, you travel along, and you have another isolated event. The combat encounters do not build upon one another. The structure of the open world design really breaks that up and then dilutes the consequences of the combat interactions. The second reason why open world design is degrading to combat focused games is because the developer loses the opportunity to jail the player. And what I mean by jailing the player is they cannot constrict the player into an area, and they cannot constrict the player and force interactions. And so in an open world game, in a game like The Rise of Ronin, when you come to one of these village encounters, what you can do is you can slowly pull out the enemies one by one. And because the open map design is so massive, you always have the option to retreat, and you always have the option to abuse the range of the enemy. You see this in Metal Gear Solid 5, and this is why, even though the combat mechanics of Metal Gear Solid 5 are amazing and really polished and really fun, the actual world design of that game is dog shit, because you can always just slowly snipe away the villages and enemy encounters if you're patient enough. And in a stealth game, patience is not that big of a resource. And so that is why when they do the rankings in the Metal Gear Solid 5 games, they have time be an aspect of it, because that's the only motive to get you to go through the mission at a brisk pace, which I think is a good idea. I'm glad it has a score-based ranking in Metal Gear Solid 5. Honestly, The Rise of Ronin should have something like that, and I'm really surprised Team Ninja didn't think about that, because if you have a combat-focused game and you have this sort of challenge of clearing out little villages in between the missions, how do you get the player to do that in a compact, combat-focused way? You really don't have a way to do that other than introducing locked-in arenas like you'll see in character action games like Bayonetta and Devil May Cry. There is a reason why these games bring in these little locked-in arenas, because otherwise Bayo and Dante could totally position spam their way through the entire game. And then you have the other example of the older Team Ninja games like Ninja Gaiden 2, even though this isn't perfect, where they made the levels more claustrophobic and restrained. They jail the position of the player so you can't escape. You have to engage. And in fact, the best moments of Rise of Ronin, the best designed sections of Rise of Ronin, are when you are jailed in, usually during the boss fights. For example, there's that first boss fight against your twin in the ballroom or whatever that is, and there's a sniper up in the window, and you have to fight in this little cloister against your highly aggressive twin. And while you're doing that, you also have to be in mind of the position of the sniper up there. So what I do is I kind of stick lower near the window and play in this sort of tighter area so that the sniper can't shoot at you. Of course, you can just shoot out the sniper if you're willing to risk it. But there you go. You have an example in The Rise of Ronin of great combat through positioning, but unfortunately, this is always clustered off to basically the boss fights, whereas the rest of the missions of the game, the rest of the combat of the game, you don't need to engage in aggressively. You can always back off. You can always regather yourself. You can always snipe away at things slowly, a bit of a time. Even if you don't have ranged weapons, you can just pull one enemy at a time out of position and slash them out. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, wouldn't these critiques also apply to other open world combat games like Elden Ring? And yes, they do. But the difference here between Rise of Ronin and Elden Ring is that Elden Ring to me is not just a combat focused game. This is why I prefer Team Ninjas to Dark Souls, because they are combat focused. But Elden Ring to me feels like grown-up Legend of Zelda. It's like grown-up Zelda where, yes, it has engaging, fun combat, but that's not the only focus of what the game is trying to do. And in fact, I don't know what the majority of Dark Souls players care about the combat versus care about other RPG elements, exploration, all that kind of stuff. It seems to be an overall general audience where there are Elden Ring players out there who like to explore and engage in the lore, and that the combat is just one facet of the game. Whereas Team Ninja games, if you're playing Nioh, if you're playing Rise of Ronin, you are there for the combat. That is what the game is strong at. This is what Team Ninja are confident in. This is the reason to buy the Rise of Ronin. But then it feels like, well, why then have this big structure that is just constantly interrupting what you want to do? This is what I was saying before. As fun as the core combat of this game is, and as much as you can get absorbed in it when you're in the missions, outside of that, you are just kind of wasting your time. It feels completely unnecessary and like an active detriment to what could have been a much better, more focused game. And I want to clarify that when you first start playing, the open world structure of the game doesn't seem too disruptive. The initial missions of the game are direct with not too much travel in between. As the game progresses, however, the gameplay density gets more watered down, and you can taste Team Ninja's desperation to pad out Ronin's length with the usual tricks of walking sections, forced exploration, and fetch quests. The meat of the missions gets thinner too, where you travel up to 10 minutes just to fight a group of mooks and a boss at the end. Sure, modern gamers may feel that the level structure of the Nioh games is outdated, but Ronin's open world design simply does not confine the player enough to induce a sense of pace. When you look at the graphics of this game, I love Team Ninja's vibe and style, and I do like a lot of the things about the graphics of this game, like how bloody it is and how you can chop people's heads off and stuff like that. Like, that Team Ninja is always nice to see. But you can tell that the graphics of this game don't stand up to its competition, its peers. You compare the graphics of Rise of Ronin to a game that came out a few years ago, like Elden Ring, it feels like it's lagging behind because it is overstretched. I think the artists at Team Ninja are plenty talented, but I think they bit off more they could chew here, and so what you end up getting is a more sort of generic looking game. It's not ugly or anything, but it's a little bit more on the generic side, especially compared to the heights of what Team Ninja were with Dead or Alive 4 and Ninja Gaiden 2 and a lot of their visually beautiful games of the past. They have the art talent there. I just don't think they have the strength and resources to make a game at this scale, at least currently. And also, I think if they had brought the game down and focused it and tightened it up, reduced the size of the game, and maybe took it to a more mission-based approach like they did with Nioh, then I think they also could have put more time and effort into the assets, into the graphics, if they had a smaller scale. I think that's naturally what could have happened. And then you look at the controls of this game, the controls of Rise of Ronin. And when I mean the controls, I mean the literal, button commands of this game are such a good analogy to the overall problems with its design, because you can tell that with the controls, they are literally trying to do too much. They ran out of buttons to the point where they have to overlap certain commands in really weird and awkward ways. The one that constantly trips me up is they put the crouch stealth to the same button as the sprint. And the way it works is that if you want to sprint, you press L3, that's what I have it on. You press L3 to sprint, and then if you want to crouch, you hold L3. But you know how often it happens that in a tight spot in combat, you want to sprint around something, and you go to sprint and you crouch, and then you crouch and just eat an incoming attack because you crouched instead of ran. And then it just feels weird stealth-wise too, that you have to hold the sprint button to go into stealth. I know why they did the overlap, because when it comes to context sensitivity and it comes to button overlap, you don't want buttons that do things too distinctly with one another. So stealth and sprint are two distinctive actions, but the fact that they're on the same button is just awkward as shit. Same thing with the jump and the grapple. The jump is essentially useless in combat, especially in a Team Ninja game, because unlike Dark Souls, the thing I like about Team Ninja combat and I like about Rise of Ronin is you have much stronger overall movement than you do in Dark Souls, so you can get around things with your little dashes and with your sprints that you can't get around in Dark Souls. And so that means you don't really need air mobility all that often. And in fact, air mobility is almost always way more risky than just sticking to the ground. And then on top of that, you have the grappling hook, which they tried to give some sort of use in combat by making it able to like grab barrels and throw them Donkey Kong style, but I don't know. I'm not really that into it, especially because we lost the heavy attack button. And instead of having a heavy attack, now you have the sort of parry button. And the thing that I do like about this game's combat, that I do think is an improvement over something like Sekiro, is the way it uses its parry. Because in Sekiro, the way the parry works is that they tied the parry to the guard button. And so by overlapping the parry and the guard, you just have the defense button, the button that you hit. There's no decision making or risk reward there, because if you have an attack incoming, you press the defense button and you either get the parry, and if you don't get the parry, you get a block. So it's a little bit of a built-in option select in that game, because if you're not getting the parry, you're going to get a block. You are going to press that button. The only question is when you're going to press the button, and is there timing? But instead, in Rise of Ronin, by making the parry a heavy attack, that introduces a much more interesting risk and reward, because even on a normal strike, if you miss the parry, if you do it too early, you're going to get a big punish, because there's this recovery period where you can't block. And then on top of that, the startup is much longer. It is a distinctive hitbox that needs to come out. And so you need to more precisely time the parry in Rise of Ronin as compared to Sekiro, and it is more punishing to miss, and instead you have the guard button being its own function. I really like this because it nerfs the parry and makes it a higher commitment, and so that opens up more viable strategies to going back to the fundamentals of blocking and movement. And I think the enemy design really complements this, because in Rise of Ronin, a strength of it is how aggressive the enemies are. When you actually get them in combat, they're coming at you full force, and they've got all kinds of crazy mix-ups so that even the regular enemies put up an interesting challenge. This is where Rise of Ronin is at its best. This is where Rise of Ronin, when it is in these situations, is really fun and satisfying. It's when you're getting locked in to tough combat situations, you got multiple enemies on top of you, but you have the tools to deal with it. They give you a lot to work with. You have the pulse type of system like you have in Nioh, that's still in there. You've got fast movement speed, you've got fast dashes. You can even walk and block at the same time at a pretty high speed. And another thing I really like about Rise of Ronin as compared to Nioh and Dark Souls is how pulled in the camera is. The camera of this game is going more back to the old school Ninja Gaiden style like angle. It's like closer up. You can see things better, and I like that. I'm not a big fan of this sort of bird's eye view camera angle in action games, because it removes a lot of the real dynamics of the spacing, and it reduces the skill test of that off-camera enemy awareness. That being said, the relative balance of being able to move around enemies and use fundamental spacing, as in not standing around and fishing for parries, as the game progresses, falls apart. The first reason is because the enemy speed becomes so overwhelming that you simply cannot get around their attacks. Movement speed is relative. It's fun that you can run fast, but if the enemies can run faster, you're not going to be able to get around them very easily, especially since your stamina gauge only allows you to dash and sprint so much before it depletes and prevents you from being able to counterattack. And so even though you should be able to get around a lot of the enemies on paper, in the end, as always, the correct playstyle becomes memorizing the strings, blocking while walking, and looking for the parry to land. On top of that, even if you are stubborn enough to try to not parry, the damage output of non-staggered attacks is so low and you are so restricted by your stamina that you're going to have to marathon battle bosses and opponents for basically no reason. I cannot emphasize heavily enough how disappointed I am that the game's balance ended up turning out the way that it did, especially in the year 2024. I am personally very tired of these parry-focused combat systems. And this is the reason why in the post-Itagaki Team Ninja output, the Nioh series continues to stand out more and more over time. And speaking of Nioh, Rōnin also learned another unfortunate lesson from Sekiro and the other Dark Souls games when it comes to the hit stun of their enemy design. Because if you go back and look at the Nioh games and the older Ninja Gaiden games, the hit stun of the enemies was much more predictable, and most importantly, on the smaller to mid-range style enemies, you were able to interrupt their strings and their attacks with your own counterattacks and stop them with hit stun in their tracks. In the case of Sekiro and also in the case of Rōnin, however, the way it works is that if the enemy is in a neutral state, in a walking state, yeah, maybe your hit stun will land, you can go ahead and hit your combos and moves there. But even if they begin to do an attack string, all of a sudden, even the smaller enemies gain super armor. So even if you can get an attack in between the strikes of their string, they'll just absorb that attack and continue onward, leaving you only the option of having to block or, of course, parry the string. And the reason why this is such a problem is, one, it makes battling multiple enemies a complete nightmare because you can't deal with multiple enemies attacking at once. One of them is going to override you. Their attacks are going to combine together and you can't parry both of their attacks. So that's a problem that once again goes back to incentivizing you to attack enemies by siphoning them out one by one. But most importantly, the major problem with this style of combat design is that it mitigates the importance of spacing and movement of fundamental combat, and instead makes parry combat the king, because even if you are able to run around and avoid all these strikes of your opponent and get around their entire string, not only are you going to use up more stamina doing that, which will prevent you from doing a good punish, but also even if you're able to get all the way to the back of the opponent and land a hit, that hit on their neutral state is going to be less rewarding than if you were to just stand in front of them, not moving, and parry the string, because not only does the parry stop the string, but the parry also gives you stagger. And it turns out attacking the enemy and putting them in stagger is more rewarding than avoiding their attacks and attacking them while they're in armored state. And so even though on paper Rise of Rōnin has all of these movement options, it turns out that they are fundamentally inferior to the good old standby of running up, holding block, memorizing the rhythm, and then just popping out the parry for the stagger. And I think that is unfortunate because rather than making the combat feel versatile, which I think Team Ninja were going for, instead it just makes the combat system feel messy by giving you a bunch of suboptimal options that aren't as good as the good old standby of just blocking and parrying. And I think this is just going to be a repeated formula we're going to see time and time again until some action game out there is finally ballsy enough to drop this formula of stamina, parry, and stagger. Hopefully that will happen sometime soon, but Rise of Rōnin is not breaking this trend in any way.
Why are you working with the foreigners?
When it comes to Rise of Rōnin, it's not that this game doesn't have strengths, but rather what it does well is constantly being interrupted by other elements that Team Ninja don't seem to even have the heart for anyway. It doesn't feel like Team Ninja are really passionate or excited about open world design. It doesn't feel like Team Ninja are really passionate and interested in RPG mechanics and leveling mechanics, and all of that side of the game mostly feels like it was a mess and was included for commercial purposes above anything else. And speaking of commercial purposes, There's one other element of these new Team Ninja games that I can't help but comment on being missing, especially with Stellar Blade on the horizon, which is the loss of, how do you say, that sexual edge, that sexiness that the older Team Ninja games have. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when Stellar Blade comes out, because it's a whole can of worms, sexiness in games. But Team Ninja, that really was a core part of their style and what they were going for in the Itagaki era. And the vibe they ended up creating was really cool, and not something I don't think other developers have been able to capture, where they weren't just sexy, they were sexy in this cool, stylish sort of way. And I miss that just as much as the sexual edge itself. And with Rise of Ronin, the game's style is just bland. It feels like aggressively bland. It feels like Team Ninja are doing penance to Eurogamer and Western gaming journalists for pissing them off all those years by making Dead or Alive games. And I know Dead or Alive 6 did not sell very well, and maybe Team Ninja feel like, hey, that reputation of making these sexy characters, these hot models, has really degraded our reputation in the gaming community, or really degraded if people take our games seriously. And I get that. And maybe you don't need to go as hard at it as you once did during the Ninja Gaiden Dead or Alive days. But the lack of anything in these games just feels off as a Team Ninja fan. And it's not just horny boy energy, I promise. There's also the loss of that coolness factor, like showing a little bit of skin, having a little bit of a form to your clothes. That's not just about sex. It's also like visually appealing. It's aesthetically attractive. And this game really lacks that. It's just aggressive plainness that is so weird to see in a Team Ninja game. If you showed me just footage of this game without combat, without the mechanics, and you just showed them running through the fields and stuff like that, I would completely believe it was some other studio than Team Ninja. That's what I'm saying about, yes, they have that core talent when it comes to making combat systems, but they've lost that gusto.
Not bad. So what exactly are you? You're much more powerful than just a human.
My strength comes from training, not from some curse in my blood.
Are you so sure of that? I was convinced once that my blood was pure, but then I saw what my pure blood was capable of. I watched as my twin sister was cursed and twisted into a greater fiend. Now I know the path I walk.
I do have to say it is something I'm missing, so it'll be really interesting to compare the sales and reception of Rise of Ronin to the sales and reception of Stellar Blade. Because I get the feeling, and this is what I'm wondering with Stellar Blade, if this is not intentional, that game is going to get a lot more attention and coverage for its aesthetics than its gameplay. And, Team Ninja used to be in that position, and, maybe they're missing out on sales because of that. Maybe they're missing out on interest because of that. It'll be interesting to see. And so, overall, what is my final conclusion of Rise of Ronin? I think it is a solid game. It is a fun game. But at the same time, the problem is, if you're going to include an open world, then at least appeal to someone that would be interested in that. I wouldn't be in that demographic, but at least appeal to that demographic, because what ends up happening now is that demographic ends up buying the Rise of Ronin and being ultimately disappointed and kind of pissed off. And then the demographic of your core combat players, the real people you are actually trying to appeal to, like myself, sure, I like the combat, but then it just feels like it's being constantly interrupted by sections and exploration that doesn't need to be there. Let's just go, man. Let's go from fight to fight, level to level. Let's do this. Let's have these decisions and problems build on each other. Jail me in. Make me sweat. The game isn't hitting its audience correctly either way. It's not hitting the crossover audience because it's not RPG enough for them, but it's not hitting the core combat audience super well either, because you're constantly boring us with dialogue and with cutscenes and with walking sections and with navigating and gliders. It's really a game that's trying to hit everyone, like Elden Ring, but instead it's kind of hitting no one. And I think that seems to be the overall consensus, and I can't really dispute it. I think that is a mistake that Team Ninja made, and maybe that was a mistake they had to make because Sony wanted them to do it this way, but overall, Rise of Ronin, if I were to give sort of a final recommendation for it, I do like it, and I do think it's worth playing, but no way at full price. At $80 especially, game prices are fucking insane. I just have to say that, especially as someone who has to buy them to review them. I don't get review copies. I pay $80 for this. My wallet is still stinging. No fucking way. At this price point, it's too much. It's crazy. What are game developers doing? There's no way people are going to consistently pay these prices. Then you read all these articles and everyone's wondering like, why are game sales down? Why aren't people buying games? Because it cost $80 to buy a game. That's why. And so what everyone is doing, and what I recommend you do, is I think Rise of Ronin's a cool game, but you gotta hang tight. You gotta wait for this sucker to drop to like $40. $40, half off. Pick it up for that, but full on 80, no. I don't think anyone's going to be happy paying that much for this game. I'm certainly kind of annoyed by it, but I'm reviewing it, so that's part of what I have to do. So thanks so much. Please, if you like this review, if you dig the channel, especially because I'm working towards going full-time here in the near future, and I've got $80 to recoup for buying this game, please like, subscribe, join the Patreon if you're so inclined, if you can, and spread the word. Tell all your friends. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Ben, Beetle Dames, Boghog, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusupovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Claricliff, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Krusty Boy, Des Audio, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dick Jones, Dingo, DJ420 Praise It, Dr. Bosky, Evan Seraphet, FCK, F Deluxe, Fergus, Friskin, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Vibra, Gameboy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hausu, Hero Death, Jake Ryan, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JVRPG, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, K, K2, K-Horse, Contain, Praise the Boys, Last of 7, Low Casting, Mieshpa, Malaise, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Meister, Mew Jam, Misha, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Ospe, Pedro Perez, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Rafael Trujillo, Raul, Real Skeen, Renthalt's Time, Retro Schmupper, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Brian Bartlett, Scanline City, Segfault, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Spiders STG, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Toho Rosardi, Travis Arbon, Sugumo, 2YU, Twilight EX, Unicorn Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, Zachary Patton, and Zeal.